The notes in question were those descriptive of the dreams of various persons covering the same period as that in which young Wilcox had had his strange visitations. My uncle, it seems, had quickly instituted a prodigiously far-flung body of inquiries among nearly all the friends whom he could question without impertinence, asking for nightly reports of their dreams, and the dates of any notable visions for some time past. The reception of this request seems to have been varied, but he must, at the very least, have received more responses than any ordinary man could have handled without a secretary. This original correspondence was not preserved, but his notes formed a thorough and really significant digest. Average people in society and business, New England's traditional quote-unquote salt of the earth, gave an almost completely negative result. Those scattered cases of uneasy but formless nocturnal impressions appear here and there, always between March 23rd and April 2nd, the period of young Wilcox's delirium. Scientific men were little more than affected, though 4 cases of vague descriptive suggest fugitive glimpse of strange landscapes. In one case, there is mentioned a dread of something abnormal. It was from the artists and poets that the pertinent answers came, and I know that panic would have broken loose had they been able to compare notes. As it was lacking their original letters, I half suspected the compiler of having asked leading questions, or of having edited a correspondence in corroboration of what he had latently resolved to see. That is why I continued to feel that Wilcox, somehow cognizant of the old data which my uncle had possessed, had been imposing on the veteran scientist. These responses from athletes told a disturbing tale. From February 28th to April 2nd, a large portion of them had dreamed very bizarre things, the intensity of the dreams being immeasurably the stronger during the period of the sculptor's delirium. Over a fourth of those who report anything reported scenes of half sounds, not unlike those which Wilcox had described, and some of the dreamers confessed acute fear of the gigantic nameless thing visible toward the last. One case, which describes with emphasis, was very sad. The subject, a widely known architect with leanings toward theosophy and occultism, went violently insane on the date of young Wilcox's seizure and expired several months later after incessant screamings to be saved from some escaped denizen of hell. Had my uncle referred to these cases by name instead of merely by number, I should have attempted some corroboration and some personal investigation. But as it was, I succeeded in tracing down only a few. All of these, however, bore out the notes in full. I've often wondered if all of the objects of the professor's questioning felt as puzzled as did this fraction. It is well that no explanation shall ever reach them. The press cuttings, as I have intimated, touched on cases of panic, mania, and eccentricity during the given period. Professor Angel must have employed a cutting bureau, for the number of extracts was tremendous and the sources scattered throughout the globe. Here was a nocturnal suicide in London, where a lone sleeper had leaped from a window after a shocking cry. Here, likewise, a rambling letter to the editor of a paper in South America, where a fanatic deduces a dire future from visions he had seen. A dispatch from California describes a theosophist colony as donning white robes en masse for some quote-unquote glorious fulfillment, which never arrives, whilst items from India speak guardedly of serious native unrest toward the end of March. Voodoo orgies multiply in Haiti, and African outposts report ominous mutterings. American officers in the Philippines find certain tribes bothersome about this time, and New York policemen are mobbed by hysterical Levantines on the night of March 22nd to 23rd. The west of Ireland, too, is full of wild rumor and legendary, and a fantastic painter named Ardois Bonneau hangs a blasphemous dream landscape in the Paris Spring Salon of 1926. And so numerous are the recorded troubles in insane asylums that only a miracle could have stopped the medical fraternity from noting strange parallelisms and drawing mystified conclusions. A bunch weird of cuttings, all told. And I can, at this date, scarcely envisage the callous rationalism with which I have set them aside. But I was then convinced that young Wilcox had known of the older matters mentioned by the professor. 2. The Tale of Inspector Legrasse. The older matters which had made the sculptor's dream in bas-relief so significant to my uncle formed the subject of my second half of his long manuscript. Once before, it appears, Professor Angel had seen the hellish outlines of the nameless monstrosity, puzzled over the unknown hieroglyphics, and heard the ominous syllables which can be rendered as Cthulhu. And all this in so stirring and horrible connection that it is small wonder he pursued young Wilcox with queries and demands for data. The earlier experience had come in 1908, 17 years before, when the American Archaeological Society held its annual meeting in St. Louis. Professor Angel, as befitting one of his authority and attainments, had a prominent part in all deliberations, and was one of the first to be approached by the several outsiders who took advantage of the convocation to offer questions for correct and answering and problems for expert solution. The chief of these outsiders, and in a short time the focus of interest for the entire meeting was a commonplace-looking middle-aged man who had traveled all the way from New Orleans in certain special information unobtainable from any local source. His name was John Raymond Legrasse, and he was by profession an inspector of police. With him he bore the subject of his visit, a grotesque, repulsive, and apparently very ancient stone statuette, whose origin he was at a loss to determine. It must have been not be fancied that Inspector Legrasse had the least interest in archaeology. On the contrary, his wish for enlightenment was prompted by purely professional considerations. The statuette, idol, fetish, or whatever it was, had been captured some months before in the wooded swamps south of New Orleans during a raid on a supposed voodoo meeting. And so singular and hideous were the rites connected with it that the police could not but realize that they had stumbled on a dark cult totally unknown to them, and infinitely more diabolic than even the blackest of African voodoo circles. Of its origin, apart from the erratic and unbelievable tales extorted from the captured members, of absolutely nothing was to be discovered. Hence the anxiety of the police from antiquarian lore, which might help them to place the frightful symbol, and through it track down the cult to its fountainhead. Inspector Legrasse was scarcely prepared for the sensation which it created. One sight of the thing had been enough to throw the assembled men of science into a state of tense excitement, and they lost no time in crowding around him to gaze at the diminutive figure whose utter strangeness and air of genuinely abysmal antiquity hinted so potently at unopened and archaic vistas. No recognized school of sculpture had animated this terrible object, yet centuries and even thousands of years seem recorded in its dim and greenish surface of unplaceable stone. The figure, which was finally passed slowly from man to man for close and careful study, was between 7 and 8 inches in height, and of exquisitely artistic workmanship. It represented a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head, whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body with prodigious claws on hind forefeet and long, narrow wings behind. This thing, which seemed instinct with a fearsome and unnatural malignancy, was of a somewhat bloated corpulence, and squatted evilly on a rectangular block or pedestal covered with undecipherable characters. The tips of the wings, which touched the back edge of the block, the seat occupied the center, while the long curved claws of the doubled up crouched hind legs gripped the front edge and extended a quarter of the way down toward the bottom of the pedestal. The cephalopod head was bent forward so that the ends of the facial feelers brushed the backs of the huge forepaws, which clasped the croucher's elevated knees. The aspect of the whole was abnormally lifelike, and the more steadily fearful because of the source was so totally unknown. Its vast, awesome, and incalculable age was unmistakable, yet not one link did it show in any known type of art belonging to civilization's youth, or indeed to any other time. Totally separate and apart, its very material was a mystery, for a soapy greenish black stone with its golden or iridescent flecks and striations resembled nothing familiar to geology or mineralogy. The characters along the base were equally baffling, and no member present despite a representation of half the world's expert learning in this field, could form the least notion of their even remotest linguistic kinship.